The Simpsons get a lot of credit for making predictions.
We've inherited quite a budget crunch from President Trump.
Sometimes, maybe too much credit. But the most informative predictions the show ever made were the ones about itself. Predictions that were never even supposed to come true. In a season 13 clip show called Gump Roast, the show did a parody of Billy Joel's We Didn't Start the Fire, highlighting a bunch of memorable moments from the show. Christmas show, Marge's playing Homer's role. And after rattling off over a decade of Simpsons plotlines, the song ends with some jokey predictions about the show's future. Have no fears, we've got stories for years, like Marge becomes a robot, Baby Mo gets a cell phone, has Bart ever owned a bear, or how about a crazy wedding? It's clearly intended as a joke, a winking acknowledgement of how long the show has been on the air, and how they might be running low on ideas. But as absurd as every one of those joke storylines is, each and every one of them has come true in some way or another, and illustrate how the show has evolved over the years, from the mundane to the surreal. Let's work backwards and start with the last one, the most egregious. How about a crazy wedding? It's kinda shocking that after doing a joke about how absurd it would be for Grampa to marry Patty and Selma, just 5 seasons later, they do an episode where Grandpa marries Selma.
Homer, say hello to your new ma!
Admittedly, Grandpa only marries one of the twins, not both, but still, the comparison is impossible to miss. Did the writers actually just get the idea from this episode? Okay, on to the next one. Has Bart ever owned a bear? Has Bart ever owned a bear? So to answer the song's question, no. Technically, Bart never ends up owning a bear. However, a season 15 episode just a few years after Gump Roast shows Homer befriending a bear in the wilderness. And while Homer doesn't exactly own the bear, he definitely domesticates it in the wild such that the last few minutes of the episode might as well be Homer owning a bear.
I don't know why bear hugs enjoy such a great reputation.
I'll admit though that that's not exactly what the prediction said. The joke of Bart owning a bear is clearly a play on the classic season 5 episode Bart Gets an Elephant. It was a somewhat outlandish premise back in season 5, but it was played relatively realistically, with the family struggling to figure out how to afford to keep such a wild, exotic animal. So Bart getting a bear would be a retread of that premise, with an even more unlikely animal. And so while Homer's the one who ended up with a bear friend, Bart did at one point adopt an enormous snake. He was also briefly gifted a tiger. Okay, on to the next one. Mo gets a cell phone. Baby Mo gets a cell phone. So of the 4 joke predictions in the song, Mo gets a cell phone is the most unique, in that, in hindsight, well, it's not really a very weird prediction. Like, of course Mo would eventually get a cell phone, why wouldn't he? The joke is a funny little time capsule, in that it shows a midway point between the show's early years, when they used typewriters and didn't have a computer, and the show's later years, when every character is obsessed with Apple products. For sake of proving that this prediction did in fact come true, here it is.
Ooh, a text.
Mo uses a cell phone. The joke of Mo getting a cell phone is clearly a reference to the show's iconic running gag of Bart prank calling Mo.
Is Seymour there? Last name, Butts.
Just a sec. Hey, is there a Butts here? Seymour Butts. Text message for I am a wiener. As you can all see, I am a wiener.
Like I said earlier, it's kind of funny how relatively mundane this joke storyline even is. It was just a quick joke though, not an entire episode. However, they did essentially do a whole subplot in season 20 about Lisa getting an iPod, and a storyline in season 24 about Homer getting an iPad. That's it, that's the whole story. What if Homer got an iPad? And to be clear, there's nothing wrong with the show modernizing itself. If the show is going to continue to have anything to say about modern American culture, the characters should absolutely live in the present. Which of course means trading in their typewriters for MacBooks. Okay, here it is. The many examples of Marge becomes a robot. Marge becomes a robot! This is the biggest one, because it is by far the most absurd of the 4 predictions, and therefore the most insane that a version of this actually came true more than once. Let's start with a relatively innocent example of this prediction coming true.
I'm ready for some lovin'.
In a quick little dream sequence where Homer imagined Marge as the Terminator.
Why did I give her a gun?
There it is, Marge becomes a robot. But clearly that's just Homer's imagination. A Simpsons character doesn't actually become a robot. Homer doesn't actually die a grisly death. That would be absurd. Unfortunately, nothing is too absurd for the Simpsons writers in season 25. It happens in that season's Days of Future Future, which will forever go down as the absolute worst episode ever.
Worst episode ever.
At least in my opinion. It's one of those episodes that flashes forward to the future, kind of like Season 6's Lisa's Wedding, or the infamous Season 11 episode Bart to the Future, that's lauded for predicting President Donald Trump. But unlike those episodes, which present the future as just, well, a prediction by a fortune teller, this episode has no framing device to suggest that the story isn't canon. And unlike, say, Lisa's Wedding, which is a very heartwarming tale about Homer and Lisa's relationship as they both grow older, with just a few silly futuristic jokes thrown in, this episode is an insane mashup of constant fantastical future jokes, as if this episode takes place at the same time as Futurama, rather than just a decade or so ahead of the present day. For instance, Bart's ex-wife is dating an alien, and Milhouse, Lisa's husband, becomes a fucking zombie for some reason. And worst of all, Homer, who dies repeatedly throughout the episode, ultimately, yes, becomes a goddamn robot. Look, I could make a whole series of videos about how much I hate this episode, so that'll have to wait for another time. But if you're looking for a crystal clear example of the prediction that a Simpsons character eventually becomes a robot, here it is. And while I noted there's no fortune teller framing device to suggest that this episode isn't canon, it's worth noting that this episode is so absurd that you've kinda got to assume that the Simpsons writers don't consider it canon, right? Well, when asked about it on Twitter by a fan, Simpsons head writer Al Jean had this to say. What is canon, exactly? There are many episodes more surreal than others. Did Homer really survive Springfield Gorge? I interpreted this response to mean that the episode was, well, open to interpretation, which means, in my book, it's getting labeled as non-canon. What's extra annoying about this episode is it's actually a follow-up to one of my favorite episodes ever, Season 23's Holidays of Future Past. It's another future episode that doesn't have a fortune teller framing device, but it's actually just a really sweet, relatable tale about the Simpsons kids as adults coming back home for Christmas. So this episode actually presents a lovely place to end up for the Simpsons characters. So this one I do consider canon. Anyway, so while I think we've covered a pretty clear-cut instance of the Marge becomes a robot storyline coming true, if you're a purist who thinks it doesn't actually count because it was Homer becoming a robot, well, don't worry, there's more. In Season 31's Hail to the Teeth, we learn that Artie Ziff, Marge's old prom date, is getting married. And it turns out he's marrying none other than a Marge robot. That's right, and he has not just one, but many Marge robots that he's built over the years. However, meeting a Marge robot isn't the same as Marge becoming a robot. But don't worry, the episode doesn't stop there. So the Artie Ziff robot storyline is actually only the subplot of this episode. The main plot is about Lisa dealing with her lack of popularity. And in the final scene, where Marge is comforting Lisa, this happens.
Told you you should smile more.
The future is now!
So, either the Marge that's comforting Lisa in that scene is actually one of Artie Ziff's robots, or Marge went ahead and got Artie to install robot wings on her back, making her essentially a bionic woman, or well, a robot. Given how much I hate the Homer robot episode, you might be surprised to learn that I actually like this episode, despite the bizarre Marge ending. But despite it being a pretty decent episode, it certainly goes to show how far the series has shifted into surrealism, since even Season 13, when the idea of a bionic Marge seemed totally absurd. And you know what? It doesn't stop there. In fact, the series seems to have a weird infatuation with turning characters into robots whenever we get a glimpse of what the future may hold for The Simpsons. Several episodes in recent years have ended with flash forwards to some version of The Simpsons' future, and they never fail to make a robot joke, which is pretty ironic given that they made fun of that idea back in Season 13. Is the show's head writer Al Jean just salty that he never got to play a big role in Matt Groening's other hit show, Futurama, which was swarming with magic robots? Well, maybe. In a Season 4 episode where Grandpa Simpson becomes a writer for the cartoon Itchy and Scratchy, the rest of the Itchy and Scratchy writing staff is filled with caricatures of actual Simpsons writers, including Al Jean. And at the end of the episode, we see the Al Jean character say this.
I'm gonna write that sitcom about the sassy robot.
Sound familiar? Now this episode aired 6 years before Futurama premiered, so it obviously wasn't intended to be a reference to Futurama. But, lo and behold, while many other Simpsons writers would go on to later write for Futurama's sassy robot Bender, Al Jean, the stalwart Simpsons writer, never did. So maybe he's just getting all his unused Futurama robot jokes out on The Simpsons when we see the future. Who knows? So there you have it. Every silly joke prediction made in the Gump Roast song actually came true in some form or another. But who knows, maybe I'm wrong, and maybe that song wasn't supposed to be making fun of these premises, and was actually a long, simmering, running gag that they would slowly fulfill each and every one of them, which would be kind of brilliant. However, if you want a more precise version of the song, using some of the episodes we discussed today, you could reword the lyrics like this.
Homer becomes a robot. Maybe Mo gets a cell phone. Has Homer ever tamed a bear? Or how about a crazy wedding?
Or,
Marge becomes robotic. Maybe Homer gets an iPad. Has Bart ever owned a snake? Or how about a crazy wedding?
so what do you think? Has the show gotten too crazy, or am I crazy for caring this much? Are there other examples of Bart owning a bear or Marge becoming a robot that maybe I missed? Let me know in the comments. And if you liked this video, please hit the subscribe button for more video analysis of our favorite family.